Morning, everyone. Last call to find your seats, please. And welcome to all of you to the 2009 Global Forum for Business as an Agent for World Benefit. For those of you that could not make our opening gathering last night, very quickly, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Ron Fry, professor here in organizational behavior at the Weatherhead School of Management. And my job is to shepherd us through a very, very busy agenda. So I'll be coming up here periodically to move us from one activity to another and to bring up some of our distinguished speakers during the next 3 days. I have one very quick logistical kind of exercise for you. If you'd all reach into your bags and pull out your worksheet and guide for the program, and then find the first white page. It's about halfway through the spiral binder, and that page just says Participant Workbook. And what we'd like you to do for the next minute or two is to number those pages, starting with 1 on the page that says Participant Workbook. 1 through 20. It's going to help us to take you through the different conversations and discussions that we have planned. So the first white page, it says Participant Workbook. That's page number 1, and then you just turn through and number them 1 to 20. Okay, without any further ado, I'd like to bring up David Cooperrider. He is the Fairmount Minerals Professor of Sustainable Value at Case Western Reserve University. Most of you know David. He's the real driver behind the Global Forums now, our second here. And David's going to set the stage for us in terms of the call of the forum, the topics and the themes that we're going to engage in. So please welcome David Cooperrider.
So thank you very much, and it's very exciting to have everyone here. I want to thank Ron Fry for those of you that were not here last night. I had introduced Ron, and Ron is the chairman of our PhD program at Case Western Reserve University. Just a wonderful colleague. We've been together working in this domain. He was the dissertation committee for me, and so thank you, Ron, for working together. I want to take a few minutes and set the stage for our work, and we're going to roll up our sleeves in a little bit and get into the conference. Yesterday, we had a great session with Gunter Pauli, talking about the possibilities of our time and the design questions and the design mind, and we want to build on that. Yesterday, after the session, someone said to me, you know, the words business as an agent of world benefit, those sound wonderful, but what about the headlines, you know? What about the headlines of our times? And you think about the unthinkable beginning to happen, the unsinkable corporation and the ethics questions, and you know, I just want to say we're starting to see a whole different perspective, and I want to just comment on some of that for a second. We launched a study a couple years ago called Business as an Agent of World Benefit, and we're gathering stories all over the world of business as a force for peace in high conflict zones, and business as a force for the eradication of extreme poverty, business as a force for eco-innovation and imagination. And I have to say, in terms of the economic headlines, I almost feel like there's a tale of two cities happening in the Dickinson sense. There are very, very wide and differing realities beginning to emerge. And as we've gotten into these 2,000 interviews of business as a force for peace and business as the eradication of extreme poverty, I have to say my sense of hope You know, in contrast to the papers, my sense of hope continues to go up, and my sense of hope continues to rise. And so I do think this is a very, very interesting juxtaposition moment in human history, where something new is being born. The head of General Electric, Jeffrey Immelt, the other day said something like, this is not just another economic cycle. This is not just another economic cycle. It's a total reset. And he said the companies and the leaders and the organizations that get it are going to thrive and survive in this new environment. You know GE's commitment to eco-imagination and eco-innovation, and throughout this recession period of time, they continue to invest heavily in the ecological and sustainability side of their business, and it's one of the few parts of their business that's actually growing at a tremendous rate. We're seeing that in our world inquiry as well in these 2,000 interviews, and you know, I'd love to share tons of stories, but let me just share one, just to talk about this idea of business as an agent of world benefit. It's one of my favorite stories. For those of you in the pre-conference workshop, I shared this one, but it'll help us set up the conceptual frame that we're working from here. A couple years ago, as part of our inquiry, I was on my way to Israel, and I was going to be talking at the Harrison School of Business. It's a new business school going up, and I was there for the dedication. On the way to Israel, I stopped in Amman, Jordan, met with former Prime Minister Majali, and this was a time, you know, the tensions, you can just, you know, it was so high. We had wonderful and deep conversations about the nature of our moment, and after I left Amman, Jordan, I saw in the papers the next day that there was a biological weapon intended to kill about 150,000 people, and that plot was stopped successfully, so on. But you could feel it in your body. You know, you could feel the kind of moment that we're living in all of these things. So, on my way to the Harrison School of Business, I changed my speech. And I said, you know, I opened the speech, and I had never talked about this topic, but I said, where's the peace going to come from? I don't think it's going to come from the military. I don't think it's going to come from our lawyers. I don't think it's going to come from our paralyzed governments. Could it be that business could be the most important force for peace in this part of the world? And I didn't have a lot of data. Again, I had changed the topic of my speech, but I gave a few examples. Afterwards, we had a reception, and about a 79-year-old man came up to me, and he tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, David, he said, your thesis was right on. He said, let me introduce myself to you. And he said, you know, he said, I'd like you to see your thesis in action. He said, can you meet me by my helicopter tomorrow morning at 8 in the morning? I said, oh my gosh, yes, okay, fine. What are you talking about? So gave me directions. I met him by his helicopter at 8 in the morning. Beautiful day, sparkling, and he begins to tell me the story. He says, we're going to the Galilee region, area called Tefan. We lift off in the helicopter, again, beautiful day, sparkling Mediterranean on this side, and then you go through deserts where there's nothing, no natural resources, just goats on hills and so on. And all of a sudden, we start descending upon this community where there are art centers and beautiful homes and research centers and schools, and in the heart of this community was an industrial incubator giving birth through entrepreneurial ideas, giving birth to new businesses. Well, it turns out over the last 10 years, they've given birth to some 300 new businesses. It now accounts for 10% of Israel's export GNP. Very successful business startups and so on. But then here was the point of the whole visit. He said, and it's all based on coexistence and co-ownership. Arab and Jewish co-ownership of the businesses and the schools and the museums and on and on. And we took tours through the plants and took tours through the schools. And here I am in a part of the world where people tell us it's intractable, you know, the hatred, the animosity, the fear and the separations and so on. and I'm walking through and just seeing a whole different reality. The high point of my moment was in the 4th grade class with 10-year-old children, and they were holding hands, Arab and Jewish children, singing songs, watching big computer screens of an entrepreneurial idea and the stages of bringing it to fruition. And I started thinking about this idea of business as a force for peace and so on. I asked Steph Wertheimer, and very few people, when I do talks, I say, how many of you heard this story? And very few have heard it. But it's the real thing. It's very powerful business, very successful business. It's not charity. It's not philanthropy. It's a new way of doing business. It says, let's unite the strengths of markets and the strengths of business with the global issues of our day, and in fact, working together. So the conflicts and so on, you know, through the economic empowerment, through the dignity of work, through the sheer interaction day to day. And I said, Steph, what's your vision for all of this? He said, David, my vision is like a Marshall Plan for the non-oil producing Middle East. What we've figured through our statistics, researching this, is that if we had something like this for every 1 million people, we'd be able to undercut the causes and roots of terror. Anyway, I wondered, why aren't we hearing these kinds of stories in our media, in the world today, and so on? So I start with that because almost all of the studies that we've been doing in our 2,000 interviews have been showing kind of a new model of business that's emerging on the ecological and sustainable questions and so on. And I'll come back to share a framework and a theoretical model to help understand that. Let me continue a little bit with one or two other stories to give a little bit more flavor, and also a little background on how this global forum came about. A number of years ago, this was around 2003, Kofi Annan called us, and Kofi Annan's staff, and they were going to beginning to organize one of the largest meetings in history among CEOs all over the world, to really look at the role that business could play, especially in the Millennium Development Projects and promises, eradicating extreme poverty and so on. It was a thrill to get the call because of our large group appreciative inquiry methodologies, where we bring 500 to 1,000 people together to do strategic planning. But the whole thing started, and this story just helps us see the speed at which all of this is happening, way beyond what we can keep up with in our leadership programs, in our management schools, and so on. But the seed happened. Kofi Annan was at a World Economic Forum meeting, and this was at a time not unlike right now, where there was a lot of mistrust about the ethics of business, and big business especially. And Kofi Annan addressed the group, but he took a totally different stance. He didn't join in that chorus. In the back of his mind, I think he knew that we cannot eradicate extreme grinding poverty in the world without great new business models and inclusive economies and a new and so on. He knew that we couldn't deal with our environmental issues without tremendous entrepreneurial activity with clean energy and so on. So instead of joining in the chorus of voices that were challenging, he reached out his hands to the business leaders and he said, let us choose today to unite the strengths of markets with the power of universal ideals, and let us choose to reconcile the forces of private entrepreneurship with the needs of the great masses of humanity. Right after that speech touched a chord. So CEOs like Lord Brown from BP, who was, leading the Beyond Petroleum efforts, and Daniel Vasella, the head of Novartis, and others sat down with him and they said, let's create a new set of principles around business and society for the 21st century. And then let's see if some companies want to join in with this. We'll call it the Global Promise, a global compact. They were hoping maybe 50 companies would sign on. Well, there were 50, then 100, then 200, then 1,000, then 1,500. And it was at that point that Kofi Annan said, let's bring this brain power together. Let's bring these 1,000 CEOs together. It was at that point that we were invited into the process, and it was a thrill to work that, one of the largest meetings of its kind. Fast forward then to Ban Ki-moon on the right-hand side of the slide. A couple years later then, after that session where we envisioned and helped develop strategies for growing this kind of process, 3 years later, we were all wondering when Kofi Annan stepped down whether this would actually continue. And it continued very, very strongly. Ban Ki-moon picked it right up and said, this is one of the most important initiatives in the world today. And again, he had very similar reasons. Business is so much important partner in all of these issues that we're dealing with. And again, this was in Switzerland then. What happened in the subsequent years, it went from 2,000 corporations to 5,000 of the largest corporations in the world. So the next meeting in Switzerland was equally exciting. I had shivers up and down my spine as I was seeing this kind of almost what I was talking about, this tale of two cities. I sat at the table and we were sharing these stories of innovation and breakthrough, and Jeffrey Sachs, pictured right there next to Ban Ki-moon. Jeffrey Sachs is pounding the table. He's the economist from Columbia who's written powerful economic analysis how within our lifetime and within our generation we can eradicate extreme poverty. And he's got the models, the econometric analysis, very little investment required, but it requires great business thinking. So for example, his Millennium Development Village concept, where for $110 per person, you can jumpstart a whole village, and within a year or so, they're going to have their own businesses, their own hospitals, their own schools, and so on. And this upward cycle, and it's very powerful. So he's pounding the table, and it sounded like a John F. Kennedy said, we can be the first generation in history to take part in such an amazing moment. Then we switched over and people started telling stories on the ecological side of sustainability. So, for example, pictured in the center is Jane Nelson from Harvard. Jane's just a fabulous leader, and she starts talking about the ecological innovations. For example, solar power. One of the statistics I heard is that if we covered 4% of the Earth's deserts with solar panels, we could power the whole human family with completely clean, renewable energy. And that's yesterday's technologies of big, clunky solar panels. So she's telling the story of nanosolar. How many of you have heard nanosolar? It's a company that's been heavily invested by the founders of Google. And they have a technology now, proprietary, where they can spray on the solar cells, so to speak, onto something as thin as aluminum foil. Again, as I'm hearing these stories, I'm saying, this is instead of the eve of management's worst hour, this is the eve of management's finest hour. I found myself feeling it. Neville Eisdell, the other person pictured there, he's the head of Coca-Cola. He stood up then, gave a talk at the podium, and he pounded the table. He said quite clearly, it is time, as I'm hearing where we're at, it's not isolated sustainability solutions that we're talking about now in need of. It is now all about systemic design. He said, it is time for all of us as CEOs to stand up, to step up, and then to scale up. And it's true, so many of the companies are going green and so on. So one of the ways that we've begun to think about all these stories that are pouring in is with a framework from Chris Laszlo. Chris Laszlo's recent book called Sustainable Value, and it's a word that we'll use a lot. So I just want to present the basic concept here. And in Chris's work, and I do urge you to read this book on sustainable value, it's just chock full of great studies, but also great conceptual models to give some language to what's happening, or at least what we're seeing happening in these stories. And, when you think about the dimensions of the firm and the theory of the firm and the concept of success and so on, obviously shareholder value perspective of the firm is very important, profitability and return on shareholder value. The other dimension, that's the vertical dimension, and that could be very positive or it could be very negative, losing lots of money. The horizontal dimension is around stakeholders and how enmeshed we are now in this stakeholder world, requiring a new stakeholder theory of the firm, a kind of a stakeholder capitalism, where many, many other voices and stakeholders, including our communities, are wanting more of a say and saying we need value from our corporations, the environment, the earth, and so on. And obviously, stakeholder value could be very, very positive, or it could be very negative. So, for example, on the upper left-hand quadrant, you have terrific shareholder value, high profitability, but on the left-hand side, very negative, in fact, destructive stakeholder value. So, for example, when GE years ago was putting toxins into the Hudson River, well, in an internet-connected world, you can no longer do that. That is, and what we're seeing when we sit down with CEOs, like the former CEO at Walmart, Lee Scott, when he started the sustainability effort, when you look at those calendars of the CEOs, upwards of 40% of their time was starting to go into very complex stakeholder relationships, creating value for communities and the relationships with NGOs and so on. So what we see are a couple quadrants that are unsustainable. The bottom right is very unsustainable. It's a company that, in some sense, has a very traditional kind of philanthropy, maybe gives a lot to its community on the right-hand side, the bottom yellow. So doing lots for the stakeholders in the community, but it's losing lots of money. I think of one of our banks here in town that was one of the top philanthropists, but it no longer exists. So that's unsustainable. What we're finding in our studies is that almost every top-rated star in virtually every industry is moving towards this upper right-hand quadrant of creating tremendous stakeholder value and tremendous shareholder value. A number of years ago, the premonition was already there. One of the papers said GM is closer than ever to bankruptcy. That same day, this was eight years ago, Toyota opened up its hybrid synergy drive commercials. What would happen if the air were clean again? So there's a mind shift happening. Like, I don't know who the strategic planning consulting firm who was working with GM and consulting on these global issues, but they were kind of treating sustainability issues as a sideline, part of a corporate responsibility department, not at the core of corporate strategy and positioning and innovation. The other companies are defining it as an innovation engine, as a capacity and a tool to spark tremendous imagination. Toyota just announced the other day that they're creating a car now that purifies the air as it operates. And so the bar on this sustainable value is continuously moving, and moving very rapidly. So Dickens' point, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the spring of hope. The last global forum was very exciting, and one of the things that I observed in the first global forum in 2006, we had an exercise where we had people talk about the economy they would most value in 30 years from now. Imagine the economy 30 years from now. What came out was a resounding kind of shared compass. It's like there is an emerging vision. Paul Hawken calls it blessed unrest, one of the largest movements in the world where minds and hearts are coming together to say this is the kind of world we want. It's a bright green economy, people said. It's eradicated extreme poverty. It's powered through renewable energy. It's globally inclusive and dignified work. It's eliminated perverse incentives. Markets have high transparency and high information and incentives aligned to help foster the global and public good as well and reward sustainable value. Now, when is management at its best? I would argue that management is at its best, the field of management is at its best when we have a shared compass direction. Let's put a person on the moon and return them safely to Earth. All of a sudden, that's when management's finest hours begin to occur, because management is about results. So I talked to Peter Drucker about some of our stories in business as an agent of world benefit. And he was very excited. This was shortly before he passed away. It was a very privileged conversation with him. Spent a whole day in his home sharing these stories, like Steph Wertheimer and others. And at the end, with a twinkle in his eye, almost as if, like, I want to, share with you a secret that he said, I wrote about it many years ago. Every single social and global issue of our day is a business opportunity in disguise, just waiting for the pragmatism of the entrepreneur, just waiting for the imagination and investment, just waiting for the capacity to create joint performance that business can create. Anyway, I think that phrase takes the whole question. We head up a journal called the Journal of Corporate Citizenship, and 90% of the articles are in the dark age conversation, the Friedman-esque kind of conversation. Does social responsibility, does that take our eye off the ball of the business and hurt the... Absolutely not, And so what Drucker is saying, it's not some proof that we're looking for. He said the best way to predict the future is to create the future. That's what this forum is about. That kind of perspective, that kind of stance that says it's our job as great leaders and managers to make it so. And that's what we want to explore. I want to go one step further, because as I work with these companies, for example, in the Tale of Two Cities, Redlands Mining Company just announced their bankruptcy. Out of Canada. They just announced their bankruptcy. They had lots of toxic waste in their mining operations, fraud in the way they reported their earnings and so on. So they just announced bankruptcy. The same week, Fairmount Minerals receives the #1 Corporate Citizenship Award. It's growing at about 40% a year. It's one of the sustainability leaders. They're creating products that can help eradicate extreme poverty. They have renewable energy facilities, and their workforce is on fire. So there is this contrast emerging, and I want to just put it forward boldly. One of the premises of this conference is that sustainability isn't just an opportunity. It is perhaps the business opportunity of the 21st century. It's going to be here. It's going to dominate the management agenda for the next 30 years or more. And the outcomes are going to determine what kind of next stages in capitalism we have. So anyway, the theme, managing as designing, if the question now is shifted from not just some destination, like imagine the economy 30 years from now, but there is an emerging, growing sense of where that direction is, then the question turns to how. And that's inspired the theme for this conference. Two of our colleagues, Dick Boland and Fred Colopy, wrote a fabulous book, a very academic, Stanford University Press, just a couple years ago, saying, what if we started looking at managers as designers? What can we learn from architects about the design mind and the way that could affect management? What can we learn from product design? What can we learn from the fields of architecture and so on? This is a Frank Gehry building, and they actually did a study of Frank Gehry's design mind and how it works and so on. Our premise that we want to explore here is that it's the design mind that potentially can turn these global issues into tremendous sources of value and innovation. Nobel laureate Herb Simon years ago outlined 3 aspects of management or organization: intelligence, choice, and design. And most of our management approaches have emphasized this second part, decision-making, decision analytics, and so on. Most of our management schools are dominated. What got glossed over was the field of design and designerly ways of knowing, the design mind, the way to create collaborative creativities, and so on. Have you ever wondered why our management schools don't look like design studios? Like an IDEO design studio? That's partly what we want to explore here as we go. So there's lots of exciting questions that are emerging for this conference, and I love this quote by Rilke: be patient and try and love the questions themselves, and live the questions now, and perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. We want to start today's session with a conversation, and we've raised some questions that we'd like you to reflect on. The nature of this conference is that is that I kind of created an equation. This is kind of a half conference, lots of speakers, and we had an astonishing 400 papers submitted. So it's a conference in that traditional sense, but it's also a summit in the sense that we want to come out with some actions. At the last Global Forum, an amazing global project was born called Principles for Responsible Management. Now 250 schools around the world have signed on. It's part of the UN Global Compact. So we're also going to have times of dialogue, roll up our sleeves, and actually come out of this summit with a few initiatives. And that's what we call a global forum. It's kind of a combination between a conference and a summit, kind of a merged, blended kind of approach. Anyway, let me invite Ron Fry to help us begin to roll up our sleeves and get into the conversation. So thank you very much for being here. We are thrilled you are here.
Thank you, David. As David said, we're going to kind of have this dance between our conversations with all the voices here in the room. We have designers, we have managers, we have academics, we have educators, we have practitioners, we have people who are all those things. And we want to go back and forth between our sense-making, our stories, our ideas, and some of the ideas of the people we've brought here to share with us their great work. So we're going to start right now, as David said, with these conversations, and if you'll go to the page that you numbered, number 4, when I ask you to number the white part of your workbook, it just says opening dialogue questions. And we're going to, David and I are going to briefly read the questions so that we hear the words all together in the room. Obviously, you can follow along. But we're going to give you just a few seconds to make a few notes quickly about what you'd like to begin talking about. And then we will pair off and have an opening conversation here for about 45 minutes with one other person that you join with these questions. So I'm going to begin on page 4. It's question number 1. We're all designers, whether we are imagining and prototyping products or services, designing organizations, framing new processes or change initiatives, or constructing our lives. Everything we make is designed, and some of it comes out of the ordinary, life-giving, and responsive to our customers, communities, and the world. As you reflect back over your life, there have been obviously ups and downs, peaks and valleys, high points and low, as it relates to designing and co-creating a better future. We'd like you to reflect on one or two of the most memorable high point design experiences in your life. Something that you consider a design experience, where you made something. And then we're going to ask you to please share a story of one or two of these high points. Where did these experiences take place? What happened? What were your feelings at the time? What were key features that made the experience memorable, powerful? And what are the insights in that story for us here today and this question in front of us? So just take a note for a minute of something that you'd like to talk about and share as a story out of your own life experience. The second part of this question, David just shared the quote from Peter Drucker. What Drucker was speaking about and perhaps anticipating was a field of positive design, which rejects the industrial paradigm of doing less bad. He called it the Hippocratic Oath, in favor of an economy that makes commercial activity into powerful, ecologic, and socially regenerative forces. With this in mind, what are some of the most memorable or important books, theories, and tools that might make a great library for thinking about our global forum themes? Managing as designing, sustainable value creation, and massive innovation or change at the scale of the whole. So what we'd like you to do here is just share so we can collect and amass all the different resources that you have found most valuable, most impressive to you in your work around these themes. Okay, Dave?
Got a few thoughts? The next one on page 6, question 2, is a search for innovations in this whole domain of business and society. So, business innovations that create world benefit while at the same time generating value for the business are today being created every second. Plug-in hybrids, biopackaging, green-collar jobs, micro-enterprise and multinational bottom-of-the-pyramid innovations, Millennium Development Villages, solar cells that can be sprayed onto aluminum foil, breakthrough combinations of fuel cell technology with biodigesters bringing electricity to billions, factories that give back more clean energy to the world than they use, companies such as Toyota prototyping cars that purify the air we breathe, and designs of industrial symbiosis where one company's waste is cradle-to-cradle food for another's operations. The stories from Novo Nordisk's 21st century leadership vision to IBM's Smart Planet to GE's recent ban on the export of electronic waste to the thousands of companies that are part of the United Nations Global Compact. These stories are proliferating more rapidly than our media can cover. So imagine now, in an effort to speed the spread and scale up our learning about these stories, that something like a Nobel Prize for Business as an Agent of World Benefit was created. Nominations are being surfaced. They consist of two kinds. Nominations of the smallest innovations that you've seen that might have the largest impact for business and society, and bolder innovations, things that very few companies have even ever yet thought about. The search, of course, is to discover innovations, small and large, that have the potential to signal not only possibilities for a better 21st century future, but also that show us the how. How do you design sustainable value? So part A, if you could nominate any sustainability initiative in the world, something you've seen or heard about, small or large, that's creating sustainable value and deserves to be lifted up and magnified, which innovations would you consider? One small innovation whose story I might share is, and then one exciting, bolder innovation, something that has world-shaping or business-shaping potential. So just jot down a couple in those, a small innovation that could have tremendous or important impact, and then some bolder innovation. And then part B, what are some of the vital strengths, leadership qualities, methods, or tools needed to turn sustainable design opportunities into business value and societal value? So just on page 7, a couple thoughts there. One small innovation that you've seen that we should lift up, one bolder innovation that you've seen that we should talk about here. Okay?
Okay, question number 3 is on page 8. Images of our future. Let's assume that tonight you fall into a sound sleep and it lasts for 10 or so years. When you wake up, it's 2020 and you are at the 7th BAWB Global Forum. Okay. The idea is to find the things you want to talk about, but then we want to give you the time to actually talk about them with each other. So you don't need to kind of fill out the entire answer, but just give yourselves a few notes so that you can move from there. Okay, so let me pull you to the number 3 if I can. Just imagine you've woken up in 2020 and you are at the 7th such BAWB Global Forum as we're having today. During those 10 years, many tiny and large innovations and changes have occurred. They spread and they connect. They add up to miracles. The world became a better world, and a world you are proud of, and a world that you value. So that's what you've woken up to in 2020. Describe what you see, things that are new, different, and better. What do you see in the world and its economy, the Earth's ecosystems, business and industry, our communities, international relationships, human well-being, the arts, sciences, and technologies, values, and the design of our management and leadership schools? In any of those contexts, imagine what is in that 2020 world that you're so proud of and value highly. Please describe what you see in 2020 and how it is complementary to, different or bolder, or more specific than the vision generated by the delegates of our previous global forum, which was held in 2006. And you'll see below some of the elements of the dreams that were shared in this room 3 years ago. It's a bright green restorative economy that purifies the air we breathe. It has eliminated the concept of waste and toxic byproducts. It is powered through solar and renewable energy innovations. It offers gainful work and has increased prosperity for everyone in the world. It provides access to medicines, healthy foods, and safe goods. In so doing, it has eradicated extreme poverty and connects people from every nation, class, and color in communication and commerce. Its open and transparent market mechanisms are built around full information, which sends market signals that generate positive incentives aligned with long-term social good. It triggers a race to the top among nations and firms to restore the planet and replenish its people. It celebrates industry-leading stars as creators of sustainable value. It is a globally inclusive system that is built on institutions that are widely trusted as positive institutions. Institutions that magnify and refract our highest human strengths into the world. Those were some of the themes of the dreams and images to this question from the first Global Forum. So what do you see in your 2020 that extends or reinforces or is even differentiated from these? So we just make a few notes there, please.
Okay. And our last question. Question 4, page 10. It's about our theme of sustainable design and leadership development and images of management education and leadership development in our corporations. Okay? So now, let's imagine our business schools and our corporate leadership programs. Let's imagine them doing transformational work in the sustainability domain, playing a leading role in achieving your vision above, your vision that you just shared. And we'd like to ask you to just play for a second with the metaphor that our management schools are like design studios. What might a management academy look like if it were designed around the metaphor of a design studio? And first, on a scale of 1 to 10, as it relates to being places of management innovation and significant state-of-the-art leadership learning in sustainable value, where do you think our management education and research is today? A 1 is we're not very far. 10 is your image of the ideal of leadership education. So I'd like you to think about, where are we now? 1's very little. 10 is your vision of what the ideal leadership education could look like, whether it's in a corporation, whether it's in business school. And most important, please describe what your 10 looks like. What does your 10 look like? So describe your 10, and how might the design studio metaphor play out? What might it look like? The curriculum, approaches to learning, the physical setting, the relationships, the learning atmosphere, student experience or energy. What skills and leadership capabilities are most figural? What kind of mindsets? Fields of knowledge and research related to sustainability and design, interdisciplinary relationships. What do you see in terms of connections, partnerships, and contributions? So, in a sense, design, imagine the ideal leadership setting, leadership development or management school setting. What's it doing? What's it look like? What does it feel like? What's the student experience? Pedagogy, approaches.
Okay, with these notes, we'd like to engage you now in just a whole lot of really good conversation and connection. We're going to ask in a moment that you stand up and pair off with someone, probably at a different table, simply because we assume many of you came in and sat with somebody you already know. We'd really encourage you to go find someone you don't know. Just discover another resource here in the room. For the next 45 minutes or 40 minutes, you'll have a chance to just sit as a pair and have a conversation around these questions. The idea of the listener here is to be a very active, probing inquirer, to really search for we often say, mine for the gold in the other person's story. To really listen and probe for, well, what meaning can we take from that experience or that story? Or in the images of the future, if they excite you and you're hearing them, or even if they're similar to some of your images, then you just join in. You reinforce that and talk even more about them together. It's less of an interview, much more of a real conversation. The questions are there to get you started. We would ask that you take just brief notes, because we will later on today at tables, we'll combine the pairs and actually start to search for some common understanding or common ideas or common images about our preferred future. So you can help yourselves to refreshments during your conversation with your partner. You can take a walk around the room if you prefer to talk while you're walking. But we'd like you to find a partner and spend the next 40 minutes or so with them. We will call you back right around 10 minutes before the hour. So you want to watch your clock and make sure each person has about 20 minutes of time to go through their thoughts and ideas on these questions. So if we could all just stand up, and again, I encourage you to move from your current table, just meet someone and enjoy the conversation.